Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so World War II, a global conflict unlike anything the world has ever seen. And just when you think it can't get any more intense.
We go from one massive war to sort of another one. Not a war in the traditional sense, but this decades-long standoff.
Right, the Cold War. The US versus the USSR, superpower versus superpower. How did we even get there?
It's a period of history that still feels, even now, almost impossible, This intense rivalry that shaped, well, everything. But when you understand the dynamics at play, it's like
getting a key to understanding the entire second half of the 20th century. And it all hinges on this one pivotal year.
1945. The world's still picking up the pieces from World War II.
Traditional powerhouses like, what, Great Britain, France? They're pretty much spent.
Yeah, you could say that. It created this void, and, well...
Nature abhors a vacuum, and who better to fill that void than the victors, right? But this wasn't just about who had the most tanks and troops after the war, was it?
You're right, it goes way deeper than just military might. Both the US and the USSR, they emerged from World War II, strong, sure, but their superpower status, that was about something else entirely.
Ideology. We see that phrase a lot in the research here, a clash of ideologies. But what does that actually look like on the ground for everyday people?
Imagine two houses on the same street, but they were built with completely different blueprints. On one side, you've got the US, the champion of, liberal capitalist democracy. Think individual rights, free markets.
That classic American dream.
Yeah, exactly, but projected on a global scale.
Yeah.
They wanted to see their version of success replicated in other nations.
So democracy, freedom, everyone's striving for their own version of the good life. That was the American blueprint. But next door, over at the USSR's house.
Totally different story. You're talking about communism, specifically Stalinism by this point, which is important. It's not just a different economic system, it's a whole way of life.
Right, because we're talking a centrally controlled economy where the state decides where things go, for good or for ill.
Exactly. And if you even thought about dissenting, let's just say it wasn't exactly encouraged.
Two very different houses. Not exactly the kind of neighbors who are going to be borrowing sugar from each other. And looking at the historical analyses, one thing that jumps out is just how quickly things got tense between them, like with the Marshall Plan.
Oh, interesting you bring that up.
The U.S. pumped billions into rebuilding Europe after the war, which, on the surface sounds like a pretty good thing to do. So what's the deeper story?
See, it's not just about rebuilding. It's about rebuilding in a specific image. The U.S. knew a struggling Europe was vulnerable, easy pickings if you're trying to spread a communist agenda, right?
So it's less about generosity and more about...
containment.
Yeah.
The Marshall Plan was as much about containing the spread of communism as it was about helping their allies.
It's like giving your friend a helping hand, but also making sure they don't start copying the bad habits of your nemesis.
Right. And containing communism meant more than just money. This is where those crucial events of 1945 come into play. The Yalta and Potsdam Conferences.
Ah, yes. The Allied leaders basically carving up the post-war world. Like, okay, you get this slice of the pie, you get that slice.
And just like with any pie, not everyone's going to be happy with their slice,
Yeah.
And while the goal was to create some sort of order in this chaotic post-war world,
It also kind of backfired, didn't it?
well, it definitely solidified these spheres of influence. And that just fueled suspicion and mistrust between the U.S. and the USSR.
It's like drawing a line in the sand, but on a global scale. And speaking of lines, there's no better example of this division than Germany, specifically Berlin.
Divided city.
A city literally split down the middle.
And not just with a line on a map, with a wall, a physical barrier. The Berlin Wall
That wasn't just a local issue either.
became a microcosm of this larger ideological struggle.
Yeah.
Talk about palpable tension.
Right, like one wrong step and boom. But why this rivalry? Why then? Of all the ways the world could have gone after World War II, why did these two players end up locked in this high-stakes standoff?
It's the question, isn't it? The million-dollar question.
Hmm.
And the thing is, there's no easy answer. It's like
trying to figure out how a family feud got started.
exactly. Everyone's got their own version of the story.
Okay, so who are the key players in this historical debate then? Who do we talk to in this family to get to the bottom of things?
Well, you've got your different schools of thought. You've got your Orthodox historians. They're like that one relative, the type.
The one who blames everything on Uncle Joe.
Right. And Uncle Joe in this case is Stalin. The Orthodox view, they put the blame for the Cold War squarely on the Soviet Union.
So what was Stalin up to that made everyone so nervous?
Well, the Orthodox historians point to Stalin's paranoia, which, let's be honest, the man had his reasons, right?
Ooh, for sure.
I mean, Russia, they'd been invaded twice in the first half of the 20th century alone. Talk about historical trauma.
Yeah, you're going to have some trust issues after that.
Exactly. So Stalin, he wants a buffer zone in Eastern Europe.
A ring of friendly countries, or at least countries he can control.
Right. To protect the USSR from another invasion.
Makes sense. If you're constantly worried about someone kicking down your front door, you're going to want a good fence, maybe a guard dog or two.
Sure. But the problem is, the fence, in this case, it involved installing Soviet-backed governments in Eastern Europe, which, naturally,
Raised a few eyebrows in the West.
you could say that. And that brings us to the other side of the family, so to speak. The revisionist historians.
Ah, yes. The revisionists.
They're the ones who are convinced it was actually your side of the family that started the whole thing.
Here we go. So who gets the blame, according to them?
The revisionists, they point the finger right back at the United States. They argue that U.S. policies, especially this obsession with containing communism.
Which, to be fair, we were pretty obsessed with that, weren't we?
Well, the revisionists argue that it actually provoked the USSR, that the U.S., intentionally or not, pushed Stalin into being more heavy-handed in Eastern Europe.
So, classic case of he started it, but with, like, global nuclear annihilation hanging in the balance.
Pretty much. It gets messy.
Is there any middle ground here? I mean, it can't all be one side's fault, right?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, because then you have the realist perspective.
The realists. Hit me with it.
They're like that wise old aunt or uncle, you know,
Yeah.
the one who, after listening to everyone else's drama, they just shake their head and...
It was bound to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The realists, they basically said the Cold War was inevitable, that it's just the nature of international relations.
Really?
You get two superpowers, each with these fundamentally different ideologies, both vying for global dominance. Conflict is almost a given at that point.
It's like putting two scorpions in a bottle and expecting them to, what, have a nice little chat.
Precisely. So you've got blame on the Soviets, blame on the U.S., and the it was bound to happen explanation.
Are we missing anyone? Are those all the relatives at the dinner table?
Oh, almost. There's one more voice at the table. The Post-Revisionists. They're like the history buffs of the family.
The ones who dig through all the old photo albums and diaries.
Exactly. They're the ones who want to understand the nuances, the complexities.
So what's their take on the Cold War? Why were we all about to nuke each other?
They say, look, it wasn't simply good guys and bad guys. It was miscommunications, miscalculations, this enormous ideological gulf between the two sides. It wasn't one event or one decision. It was this whole web of actions and reactions that spiraled out of control.
Okay, so we've got 4 different perspectives, all with their own arguments, their own interpretations of history.
Yeah.
Then, just when you think this rivalry couldn't get any more intense,
Something happens that changes everything.
the nuclear age arrives.
Right.
Talk about upping the stakes.
Right. It's one thing to be jostling for global influence, but now it's like everyone's playing poker with a hand grenade on the table.
So the US and the USSR, they're locked in this ideological deathmatch, and now suddenly, nukes. Did anyone even try to hit the brakes?
Well, the good news is no mushroom clouds. That's the somewhat comforting part of mutually assured destruction.
Never made.
Yeah.
Catchy, right, but terrifying when you think about what it actually means.
It really was this completely mad situation. Both sides had enough firepower to wipe each other out multiple times over.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just military targets, you know. The whole planet was at risk.
People building bomb shelters in their backyards, kids hiding under their desks in school, like that was actually going to do anything.
It was a scary time. A lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty.
So with the threat of total annihilation just hanging over everyone's heads, how did they even function? How did the US and USSR manage this rivalry without blowing everything up?
Well, they had to get creative. Not in a good way.
Because direct conflict was off the table.
Right, you couldn't risk that.
Yeah,
so the
yeah.
Cold War became, it was like this high-stakes chess match with incredibly high stakes. And one of the most dangerous pieces on the board, proxy wars.
Proxy wars. Break that down for me.
Basically, wars fought by stand-ins. The U.S. and USSR wouldn't fight each other directly, but...
But they'd back opposite sides in other conflicts.
Exactly. Think Korea, Vietnam. These were proxy wars, a way to weaken the other superpower's influence without.
Without triggering World War III.
Exactly.
So it became less about direct confrontation and more about, what? Outmaneuvering your opponent? Outlasting them?
It was all about strategy. espionage, propaganda, the space race. You name it, it was part of the Cold War.
This rivalry, it was like it seeped into every aspect of life for decades. But it couldn't last forever, could it? Even the Cold War had to end eventually.
It did. The Soviet Union, it was dealing with a lot of internal struggles, and, well, in 1991, it dissolved.
And with that, poof, the Cold War was over.
Just like that.
Which is wild to think about, right? This rivalry that defined most of the 20th century. But for anyone born after, say, the mid-'80s, it's ancient history.
And yet, the legacy of the Cold War, it's still with us.
Oh, absolutely. The geopolitical alliances we see today, the way different countries approach things like democracy and individual liberty.
It all goes back to the Cold War, to those decades of rivalry
Yeah.
between the US and the USSR.
It's like those family feuds that go on for generations. No one really remembers what the fight was about in the first place, but...
Right, but everyone's still choosing sides based on some old grudge.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? Why does any of this Cold War stuff matter to them?
Because history isn't just about the past, right? It's about understanding the forces that have shaped the world we live in. So the next time you see a conflict brewing between nations, or hear a debate about nuclear weapons,
Or even just see how different countries are run.
think back to the Cold War. It might just give you a fresh perspective.
It's like that old saying, if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. But it's not just about avoiding the mistakes of the past, is it?
Right. It's about understanding how those events, how that history continues to echo into the present and shape the future.
From the rubble of World War II to the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation, we've gone deep on the Cold War, haven't we? We've explored the ideologies, the strategies, the consequences, this epic rivalry that shaped a generation. But even though the Cold War is over, the story isn't, is it? It's still unfolding, still shaping our world in ways we might not even realize. So keep asking those questions, keep exploring, keep digging deeper into the past because, well, it might just help us navigate the future.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.